George H.W. Bush was the 41st President of the United States and had one of the greatest foreign policies in the history of the United States during his tenure from January of 1989 until January of 1993, despite only being a one-term president. But first, we need some context on how Bush became an epic foreign policy genius. During World War II, George H.W. Bush was the Navy's youngest aviator at age 18, flying a Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber and assigned to Air Group 51 and the USS San Jacinto. He flew his first bombing mission over Wake Island, which was occupied by the Japanese. At the Philippines, Bush was sent to attack a Japanese installation in Chichijima, where he hit the target several times before being downed by Japanese fire. Of the 9 airmen sent on the mission, only Bush survived as he was rescued by the submarine USS Finback. But of the other airmen, some were beheaded and others were eaten by the Japanese. For his actions in the mission, Bush was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. In 1945, he trained for the invasion of Japan, but the nuking of the Japanese led to the cancellation of Operation Downfall. By the end of Bush's naval service, he had flown 58 missions, done 128 carrier landings, and recorded 1,228 flight hours. He was elected to Congress in 1966 and was supportive of Nixon's Vietnamization policies and was actually considered by Nixon to be his running mate instead of Spiro Agnew in 1968. In 1971, Bush became the United States ambassador to the United Nations. There he had a front row seat in dealing with the Soviets and Red China as the Nixon administration sought a policy of détente. When Red China replaced Taiwan as China's UN seat on the Security Council, Bush was the only UN member to meet with the Taiwanese ambassador afterwards. Another instance at the UN was the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, where he joined with India in condemning the Pakistani genocide in Bangladesh. After the UN, Nixon appointed Bush to be the chair of the RNC after the landslide 1972 election, and Bush was actually considered again by Nixon to be a solid candidate to replace Spiro Agnew as vice president in 1973, but Nixon opted to choose Gerald Ford instead. Bush continued to support the Vietnamization program, and after the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation, Bush wanted to leave Washington due to how politicized things had become. Ford strongly considered choosing Bush as his vice president in 1974, but instead chose Nelson Rockefeller instead, and at Bush's request, he became the second special liaison to China. In mainland China, Bush followed a policy of personal diplomacy where relationships between ambassadors would affect relationships between governments. This policy was in stark contrast with Henry Kissinger, who wanted a more reserved U.S. policy in China. Bush would befriend Deng Xiaoping, who would reduce the cult of Mao in Chinese politics and reform China to be more of a market economy, which was pretty big in the 1970s and 80s. Bush would also attempt to maintain American prestige in China in the face of the fall of Saigon, where American reputation was at an all-time low during the Cold War. Additionally, the Chinese had seen the resignation of Nixon as completely ridiculous. Under the Ford administration, Bush was named the 11th director of the CIA from January 30th, 1976 until January 20th, 1977. As director of the CIA, Bush was tasked with restoring the agency's morale and public reputation in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal and various operations that had occurred during the Vietnam War. In June of 1976 in Lebanon, the PFLP kidnapped and assassinated American Ambassador Francis Malloy Jr., Robert Waring, and their driver, and dumped their bullet-filled corpses in a garbage bin. Bush and the CIA determined that the PFLP was responsible, and the PLO arrested the assassins who were then executed by the PFLP who feared American retaliation. After Nelson Rockefeller decided to withdraw from the 1976 election as Ford's vice president, Bush was again on the short list, but Ford chose Dole instead. Bush also briefed Congressman Ed Koch when the CIA learned of a plot in July of 1976 by 2 Uruguayans and the Chilean DINA, which was Pinochet's secret police, to assassinate the congressman. Additionally, Bush regularly gave national security briefings to both Ford's running mate Bob Dole and Jimmy Carter when he was a candidate in the 1976 election. Bush and Carter discussed the possibility of Bush remaining in his position as director of the CIA in the Carter administration, but both essentially agreed against it as Stan Turner succeeded Bush as director of the CIA. Bush's foreign policy experience made him an ideal candidate in 1980 amid the Soviet-Afghan War and Iran hostage crisis, and he was chosen as Reagan's vice president after Reagan's deal with former President Gerald Ford for becoming vice president fell through. As Reagan's vice president, Bush oversaw the National Security Crisis Management Organization for the administration, and he also met with bipartisan congressional groups for Operation Urgent Fury, being the 1983 invasion of Grenada. Also in 1983, Bush convinced skeptical NATO allies to agree to deploy the Pershing II missiles in Europe. After becoming President of the United States after winning the 1988 election, Bush had tried to get the OAS together for an invasion of Panama in Operation Just Cause in December of 1989, as the Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega was a big player in the drug trade and supported the Medellin cartel. In 1988, Noriega had also been receiving support from the Soviets, Cubans, and Gaddafi's Libya, as well as he arrested an American expat and increased crackdowns after a failed coup in October of 1989. Although the OAS did not agree to the invasion, the United States would do so anyway, and the invasion lasted a little over a month and was strongly approved by the Panamanian population, with 76% of Panamanians also responding that they had wanted the invasion to come sooner in October. Regarding the rest of Latin America, Bush engaged in cooperative operations with Colombia, which strongly reduced Pablo Escobar's influence within the country. For Cuba, Bush pressed Castro to release the human rights records of Cuba since the Cuban Revolution, and in response, Castro had a meltdown and claimed that the U.S. was violating international law by allowing for Cubans to seek asylum within the United States. Bush also recognized the Nicaraguan government and pressured democratic reforms onto the country. He cooperated with Venezuela to help attain a peace to the bloody Salvadorian Civil War and ensured humanitarian support for Honduras. U.S. and Chinese relations sharply deteriorated with the Tiananmen Square massacre by the CCP and had reverted almost back to as bad as they were before Nixon went to China. Bush secretly negotiated with China to remove economic sanctions, and in return, the U.S. and China would renew Sino-American normalization talks. However, with the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the Chinese had a resulting paranoia of America. But China had grown to like capitalism when they adopted it in the 1980s and was forced to remain an engaged actor in getting foreign investment. Regarding the rest of Asia, the Bush administration pulled nuclear weapons out of South Korea as a gesture to North Korea to try and reapproach bilateral, non-nuclear treaties with the South Koreans. Despite North Korea not really caring, the show of concessions on the U.S. end was both a massive win in the international world, as North Korea showed its true colors against reapproachment with the U.S. and South Korea, but also the U.S. was able to reduce defensive spending in the region as South Korea and other Asian nations decided to share defensive responsibilities. After Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, Bush brought together an international coalition in the Gulf War for Operation Desert Shield and then Desert Storm. A massive air attack came first and was followed by coalition troops forcing the Iraqis out of Kuwait with limited strikes into Iraq. Bush chose not to topple Saddam Hussein with the coalition as he feared it would create a power vacuum and that Iran would take advantage of the weakened Iraqi state. He instead encouraged the Iraqi military to overthrow Saddam, but that didn't work out. When Saddam attacked the Kurds in the north and Shia groups in the south for rebelling against him, Bush launched Operation Provide Comfort to establish a de facto Kurdish state to be semi-autonomous and protected against the Baathists. And then he also launched Operation Southern Watch to enforce no-fly zones to protect the Shia groups. The sanctions placed on Iraq after the Gulf War under Bush were aimed at compliance with the UN and were not aimed at regime change. After the Gulf War, both Israel and the Arab world loved Bush and the U.S., so an attempt was made to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict at the Madrid Conference. The Cold War in 1989, during Bush's first year in office, witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall and of communism in Eastern Europe. He perfectly finessed the foreign policy difficulties of this geopolitical situation so that the USSR and communism would implode instead of explode all over Europe. He oversaw the reunification of Germany and the early introduction of capitalism to former Iron Curtain countries, as the USSR was still around at the time. After the fall of the wall, Bush and Gorbachev met at the Malta Conference to carefully discuss the future of Eastern Europe. The end of the Cold War came with the disillusionment of the USSR in 1991, and again, communism would implode instead of explode. After the Soviets left Afghanistan in 1989, Bush supported the Mujahideen as long as they would maintain a stable state afterwards. Bush also negotiated with Pakistan to stop supporting radical factions such as HIG and the Taliban, and that in 1992 both would remove themselves from Afghanistan. Bush also sought to have the U.S. mediate the post-Afghan Civil War conflict, as America had supported all the rebels against the DRA, but with the Battle of Kabul, the radical elements that Pakistan had previously supported turned Afghanistan to another civil war in April of 1992, which then became exacerbated after Bush left office and Pakistan was free to support whoever they wanted. Turning to Somalia, the UN had bitten off way more than they could chew with UNISOM 1, where the UN wanted to broker and observe a ceasefire in the Somali civil war. But, Somali warlords see UN peacekeepers as free real estate in the region. Therefore, Bush launched Operation Restore Hope in December 1992 and UNITAF, where the US Marines were sent in and restored order. But things would get messed up when Clinton and his infinite wisdom withdrew the Marines and fighting escalated to result in the Black Hawk Down situation. With the breakup of Yugoslavia, Bush had originally discouraged the separatism in Yugoslavia as he foresaw lots of violence in the region would ensue between many different ethnic groups that would not get along very well because, it's the Balkans. But once it started, Bush recognized Croatia and secured UN support to go into Bosnia following the siege of Sarajevo. Post-Soviet Russia witnessed all of the Russians hating communism during the last months of the Bush administration. Yeltsin and Russia removed long-term missiles that were pointed at the U.S. and major de-escalation occurred between the two powers. Bush also planned on supporting Russia in its transitional phase between capitalism and communism regarding government and economy, but this would not come to be as Bush lost re-election in 1992 and Clinton had no idea how to properly run American and Russian relations, which caused Russia to become a living crap hole in the 90s. What do you think about George H.W. Bush's foreign policy? Would you like me to cover the foreign policies of other American presidents or other world leaders? Do you want me to make a video where I relentlessly rant about and trash on Clinton's foreign policy? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.